Hi, everyone. We're here to do an update for the manufacturing and distribution industry and focus really on the economic impact on the industry over the last 18 months, as it's been a very hectic 18 months. Joining me today will be John Giordano out of our Long Island office. Corinne, if you don't mind going to the next slide. John Giordano out of our Long Island office. He'll actually be fielding questions today, so you can either put your questions to the Q&A box or directly message John, and he'll accumulate those questions, and we'll go to those questions at the end of the session. I'm Mark Henry. I'm a partner out of our Braintree office and a co-leader of the manufacturing and distribution team. And Mark Fagan is also a co-leader who won't be joining us today. One of the things that we've done, it's our second annual survey. We're very excited to be able to continue this tradition, is do a survey. We partner up with Fin Partners. They actually did the survey during Q1 of 2021, so right around springtime. And our goal for focusing there was really, we thought at that point we were reemerging from COVID. Obviously, with the Delta variant, things have changed a little bit, but it was a really key indicator of how everyone was feeling at the time going into the summer months. We targeted our survey for VP of operations, really the C-suite or ownership of businesses focusing on $10 million in revenue or more. We had about 200 respondents that took the survey. 34% were manufacturing only, 26% were distribution only, and the remaining 40% were classified themselves as manufacturing and distribution. Now, some of the key findings from the survey, there were a lot of things that came out of the survey, but really what we found is that over the past year, a lot of companies had to pivot either because their industry shut down, they're tied to restaurants, whatever the issues were, and they really focused on new product offerings or new service offerings. Some of those things, and Anirban will talk about those, is some of those, will those change consumer behavior forever? Or are those things that are going to stick forever? Or are those one-time kind of hits and flashes in the pan that are not sustainable? The other thing that we're constantly hearing about is supply chain disruption. I think from the spring with chicken wings and pool salt shortage, all the way till now, if you're shopping for a new car, you clearly know there's a microchip shortage and really have a tough time getting a car. And then the shift to e-commerce. Our survey showed that e-commerce has exploded. And if you had a platform for e-commerce going into COVID, you're very well positioned to increase profit margins. If you did not, you had to shift because consumer behavior has shifted completely or very fastly to e-commerce. Now, with all of that said, I'm very happy that we have Dr. Anirban Basu with us. Dr. Anirban is the chairman and CEO of Sage Policy Group. We've been partnering with Anirban for about 5 years now. He's a phenomenal speaker and serves a variety of industries as the chief economist, doing guest speaking and just analytical services for his clients. Dr. Anirban, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to Citron Cooperman for the invitation and the opportunity to be with you all. This presentation, of course, is about the latest Citron Cooperman Manufacturing and Distribution Pulse Survey. What I've done for you today is I have blended macroeconomic data with the survey results to tell a bigger story. The survey, certainly with its 200 responses, could stand on its own statistically, but I wanted to tell a bigger story and also try to provide some insight into what 2022 might bring. And so let's begin. Next slide, please. Let me just talk about where we've been. So 18 months, that's about right in terms of how long this crisis has been in place. The US economy was undone in March of 2020 as we shut down the economy. Officially, the recession began in February of 2020. That's when retail sales began to become choppy, as some people had heard about COVID-19 by that point and had begun to withdraw at least partially from the economy. Global story, of course. This map comes from the International Monetary Fund. This is a reflection of 2020 global economic growth. And on this map, green is good because green signifies growth. And you see some green here. Most prominently in China, the Chinese economy growing 2.3% last year, and that had everything to do with manufacturing, distribution, and e-commerce. With American consumers not able to go to ball games to spend $12 on a beer or $9 on a hot dog or take vacations or engage in other services, they shifted their consumption to goods. And I'll share some data on that regarding that with you in a moment. And so we stimulated through that e-commerce channel a lot of Chinese supply chain. And so the Chinese economy actually grows. They were not alone. East of the Caspian Sea, nations like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan grow. These are natural resource intensive societies. Same thing in Western Africa. Now on this map, red is bad because red signifies that economy shrank, and most of the world is in red. Next slide, please. And I can offer you some additional granularity around this. You can see toward the bottom of the slide, again, this comes from the International Monetary Fund, that 2.3% estimated growth rate for the Chinese economy. The US estimated to have shrunk 3.5% economically last year, hardly the worst performers, not even in North America. The Canadian economy shrinking more than 5%, the Mexican economy more than 8%. The worst performers may very well have been the Europeans, the French economy shrinking around 8%, the Italian economy nearly 9%, the Spanish economy nearly 11%, and the United Kingdom with its worst year since 1709 economically. That, of course, the year of the Great Frost. Last year, the United Kingdom shrinks nearly 10% economically. That is a big deal. And of course, all of these things have impacted who's been buying, what they've been buying, how they've been buying it. And we want to talk about all of these kinds of supply chain issues in terms of business-to-business commerce, but also consumer from business commerce as well. But we'll talk more about this as we go through the presentation. Next slide, please. So, for me to suggest to you that the U.S. economy shrank 3.5% last year would be A, accurate, and B, would miss out on a ton of nuance. Yes, there are moments during which the U.S. economy performed perfectly abysmally last year, but there are other moments of rapid economic rebound, quite heartening. So this is quarterly gross domestic product, and there are two colors of bars here, blue and red. The blue color bars, again, quarterly GDP stretched through the fourth quarter of 2019, reading left to right. Now, you'll remember what the issue was coming into 2020. What was the primary issue? I can't find workers to support my growth. At that time, the U.S. unemployment rate is 3.5%, a 50-year low. By the way, that is a principal challenge today that I'll get into as well. So in some sense, some things have not changed. But we entered 2020 with lots of momentum. The outlook was very good for the year. And of course, it didn't turn out to be the way that many people had expected, thanks to COVID-19. Now, the blue color bars are indexed to the left-hand axis, the vertical axis, the red color bars to the right-hand vertical axis. I had to bifurcate the vertical axis for reasons I'll get into. And the first red color bar is the first quarter of 2020. Now, as I say, we came into 2020 with momentum. America added jobs in January, added 289,000 jobs in February, then shuts down its economy in March. And March is so horrific for the economy that it takes the entire first quarter of 2020 down with this statistically. From the first quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy shrinks 5% on an annualized basis. Now, that's a big deal by itself, ladies and gentlemen. And during the fourth quarter of 2008, which had been the worst quarter of our economic lives, the U.S. economy shrinks 8.4%. So a negative 5% print is a big deal. Unfortunately, this time around, it was merely the appetizer. For during the second quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy shrinks 31.4% on an annualized basis. And that has got to be a shock to manufacturers and distributors alike. And around that time, there's this raging debate in the economics community about what the initial phase of recovery might look like. Would it be U-shaped, L-shaped, Nike swoosh, checkmark, square root, hockey stick? It was a straight up V. V for vibrancy or vitality, or a partial restoration thereof. For in the third quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy grows 33.4% on an annualized basis. Now, how does this matter to manufacturers and distributors? Well, in many ways, of course. But it is quite easy, I think, what we have found over this last 18 months to destroy capacity. It's pretty simple to lay off workers, let them collect stepped-up unemployment insurance benefits. It might actually be fairly simple to close factories and take write-offs on corporate taxes. What we have found is that bringing that capacity back online is really challenging. And that might help explain why we are having the supply chain disruptions as we are right now. I don't know if you saw the announcement from 3M this morning about supply chain disruptions continue to impact that business. Significant cost increases facing that business, cost increases that cannot be fully passed on to final customers. So 3M stock prices fell early this morning as an example. Nike, same kind of situation. But V-shaped recovery, 33.4%. U.S. economy starts to lose momentum by the fourth quarter of last year. Stimulus is injected into the economy December 27th by the Trump administration. Then again on March 11th of this year by the Biden administration. We've been growing ever since. Second quarter GDP was 6.6%. And in terms of gross domestic product, we have now fully recovered. GDP by the end of the second quarter was 0.8% above what it had been pre-pandemic. So there's that. But of course, we're going to talk about many things that have not recovered as we go through this material. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the survey now, shall we? So you've heard some of the major findings. Supply chain disruptions and constraints force businesses to pivot. Well, that is an understatement, of course. Global supply chain disruptions have resulted in greater diversification of suppliers, outsourced manufacturing, and reshoring to the US. We'll talk about all of these things. New product and service offerings. More than half of manufacturing distribution companies surveyed introduced new products or services in response to COVID-19, and a majority of businesses expect to continue these product service offerings beyond the pandemic. And that's one of the things I want to do for you this morning. I want to try to differentiate permanent impacts associated with the pandemic with temporary impacts. And I think what you're going to see in the material here, whether it's survey-based or macroeconomic data-based, you're going to see a lot of stickiness here in terms of behavioral changes. The shift to e-commerce is no longer a trend, it's a landslide. You saw that language just a moment ago. Nearly half of respondents now say online sales make up 50 to 75% of their total sales. 68% of companies saw significant or exponential growth in e-commerce sales in 2020. 69% of survey companies work with Amazon either directly or indirectly. So, a lot of economists and other observers focus a lot on what consumers are doing. How much are consumers buying online versus at brick and mortar points of sale? And that's fine. That's an important aspect of life on which to focus. But less focus is given to business e-commerce transactions. And from the business to business perspective, that's where the landslide really is. So much of that sales, so many of those sales have now begun to take place online. And again, I think this probably has some stickiness. And during Q&A, and I'll leave some time for Q&A at the end of this hour-long session, please ask me about that. I'd love to get your insights into how sticky some of these things are likely to be in terms of how businesses have changed over the course of this past 18 months. Next slide, please. More data here. In 2020, supply chains have obviously pushed to the brink. The cost of containers from China soared and the time to get containers slowed. And you're probably hearing ongoing issues at the ports of Southern California, in the Midwest, for instance, transshipment points in Chicago, and that's been a burden or a barrier to transporting goods from west to east and east to west. Trade tariffs and geopolitics have exacerbated these challenges. Of course, global supply chains were shifting prior to the pandemic, partially because of these trade tariffs and trade wars. Recently, Chinese authorities have been unwavering in their commitment to stamping out COVID. Accordingly, only a small number of cases can shut down a considerable amount of activity. We see the same thing in Malaysia and in Vietnam. Authorities in China recently shut down large portions of the world's third busiest container port after a single worker was found to be infected by COVID-19. Now that's remarkable. To shut down so much global commerce, so much container cargo because of one illness. I'm not saying that's good policy or bad policy. I'm just saying it is what it is. And this Delta variant is virulent. And so I think we can expect more infections going forward in various parts of the world. And therefore, these ongoing supply chain disruptions are set to last well into 2022. Next slide, please. Some more survey data here. According to the Citron Cooperman Pulse survey, 33% of respondents listed supply chain as one of their top two challenges. No surprise here. 56% listed altering the business model as one of their top two challenges. And that's one of the things that we're going to explore during this webinar is what you have done, what you manufacturers and distributors have done in response to these shifting economic forces. And my very strong sense, based on the survey data, is you have been very aggressive in altering your business model, taking massive steps to change that business model, whether your staffing model or the suppliers that you utilize or how you distribute products, so on and so forth. 66% of companies surveyed said that they have changed how a product is sourced due to a disruption in the global supply chain. So 66% are diversifying suppliers, 59% are looking to outsource manufacturing, 44% are reshoring to the United States. And you can see the graph on the right there summarizing all of this statistical detail. But I mean, you can't just sit on your hands, obviously, and you haven't been as a group. Diversifying suppliers and so on and so forth, and looking for other opportunities to contain costs at a time when costs are really rising rapidly. And I'll talk more about costs in just a moment. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of those costs, shall we? So continue to receive data frequently on producer price indices and consumer price indices. And all of them are suggesting the same thing, that while many economists and many Federal Reserve policymakers over the course of this year have been indicating that the inflation is merely temporary, it's transitory, but it has not been transitory thus far, has it? A lot of economists by this point would have said, from the perspective of earlier this year, by the second half of 2021, these supply disruptions will be largely gone. But they are still here. And in some cases, they are worsening. And so that translates into input shortages, of course, and also bidding wars and higher prices. So here's some producer price index data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, data for August of 2021, fuels and related products and power, up 33% in terms of price compared to February of 2020, the month before the economic crisis begins in America. Chemicals and allied products up 21%, rubber and plastic products up 15%, lumber and wood products up 28.5%, metals and metal products up 42%, iron and steel 87%, copper-based scrap 59%. Remember, the Federal Reserve's target is 2% inflation. So if you look at these numbers versus 2% annual inflation, you can see, my goodness, no wonder people are scrambling to change their suppliers, change supply chains generally, to try to mitigate the impact of some of these cost increases. And these cost increases, by the way, are a reflection largely of shortages, difficulty acquiring various inputs and outputs. And so whether it affects the US auto industry because of computer chips, or the US pool maintenance industry because of a shortage of chlorine, all this is affecting players throughout the economy, but of course, manufacturers and distributors in particular. Next slide, please. Now, again, some more macroeconomic data here. This is the cash truckload Linehaul cost index. I've graphed it for you back to 2005, and this is something of which you are aware, of course, that freight costs have risen. This is truckload. So this is a measure of sort of how much it costs to transport dry goods by truck. And this does not, by the way, reflect the cost of fuel. It's just the capacity of the truck that this reflects. And you can see this index is absolutely taken off. And so, again, this puts further costs, delays shipments, and is one of the reasons that if you want to order various things, you might hear that, well, it'll be available in June or July. And then you say, well, June or July is already passed. No, we mean June, July of next year. And there are many household goods and other goods in the economy that face that kind of backlog. Next slide, please. Something similar here. This is the Baltic Dry Index. When I was a single man in the 80s and 90s, I'd often introduce the Baltic Dry Index into my conversation with young women in an attempt to garner interest. And I got to tell you that very little interest was garnered. It did not work. But it's a very interesting indicator. It is an indicator of the price of shipping, meaning by sea, major raw materials such as metals, grains, and fossil fuels. So the previous slide I showed you was about trucking costs. This is about shipping costs. And of course, shipping costs have risen too. And so everything in the world is becoming much more expensive. And so if the inputs become more expensive, generally, whether it's steel or iron ore, and then it becomes more expensive to transport those inputs, that adds further cost. If then it costs more for the people to unload those ships because labor has become more expensive, and then once that's transported to the plant, of course, the trucking costs are more expensive too, and now at the plant, people are more expensive as well. And so this inflation story is real. And I think at some point the Federal Reserve will be forced to get off this soapbox of this is transitory. And one of the things that's going to be sticky about this inflation is the rising wages. Because once people raise wages to, let's say, $15 an hour, $17 an hour, whatever it happens to be, you can't claw that back. If you try to say, look, we have 10.9 million available unfilled jobs in America, as it turns out, late July, 10.9 million, that's easily a record. We have about 83 unemployed people per 100 job openings in this country. So right now, who has the negotiating power? It's the labor force. It's the workforce. Then, at some point, I presume things will normalize. We'll be through this COVID-19 experience. And at some point, employers might say, well, I'm really paying these workers too much based on their productivity. I offered them a lot of money when I was dealing with these human capital shortages, but now I want to bring down my wage bill. Maybe I'll go to them and say, you know what, I was paying you $17 an hour. I'd like to go back to 13. Is that cool? It's not cool. That's when people start throwing rocks, or even worse, saying mean things. So some of this inflation is sticky. Next slide, please. This is the producer price index for all manufacturing industries. Again, more macroeconomic data here. And what this is a reflection of the amount of money manufacturers are receiving for their output. So what have we just said? We've said that input costs have risen, freight costs have risen, labor costs have risen, and then of course manufacturers will try to, and they should, protect their margins. So what do? They pass along cost increases to their customers. And so the inflation goes from input to output, and it revolves and circulates across the economy. So as of August of 2021, the producer price index for all manufactured goods was up 13% since February of 2020. Well, again, that clearly outstrips a 2% annualized rate of inflation target that the Federal Reserve has. And I think some of you might agree with me, and we'll talk more about this during Q&A, that some of this is not particularly transitory, that this inflation is stickier. But I have to say that the Federal Reserve officials, whether the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell or others, have stuck by the story that it's transitory. Then I have to say that if you look at the bond market, if you look at interest rates, which today are around 1.32% or 1.33% on the 10-year Treasury, that the bond market seems to believe that a lot of this inflation is transitory as well. Otherwise, we would see much higher interest rates than we're seeing right now. As of this moment, we're at 1.322% on the 10-year Treasury. So, and I would say, yes, some of the inflation is transitory. Don't get me wrong. That it takes time to build capacity, whether sawmill capacity or steel manufacturing capacity or computer chip manufacturing capacity. And at some point, as capacity comes online, thanks to these high prices that induce people to invest more in capacity, that some of these prices will begin to fall. That's true. But I'm simply suggesting that not all of this inflation we've been experiencing is transitory. Some of this is sticky. And again, especially that inflation that relates to wages. Next slide, please. So back to the survey. So one of the solutions here, if the issue is, well, the Chinese have shut down their ports. As a manufacturer, we've been manufacturing in China or had significant portions of our supply chain there. We're trying to protect intellectual property. The Chinese workers are no longer as inexpensive as they used to be. The Chinese government is becoming increasingly active in the Chinese economy. We've seen that in recent weeks and months. And so I want to reshore some of that production back to North America. And one of the things that happened just before the pandemic was that Congress ratified the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement. And among other things, that trade agreement creates greater incentive for manufacturers to bring more of their supply chain back home to benefit from favorable tariff treatment. So the requirements for favorable tariff treatment are stiffer under the new agreement, the trade agreement, the new NAFTA, USMCA, than they were under the original NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so that's part of the context of the reshoring episodes. But the pandemic clearly has created more of a compulsion to reshore to America, but there are hurdles, and that's what this gets to out of this Citrin Cooperman survey. Which of the following do you feel are hurdles to reshoring? 74% capital investment costs. Because it is tough to, for instance, abandon capital or capacity that's sitting in Asia or Mexico or wherever it happens to be. Cost of U.S. labor, of course. I mean, why were things outshored or offshored in the first place? Because often American workers are very expensive. And as a country, and you may disagree with me on this, and again, we can talk about this during Q&A, I don't think we've done a very good job training an industrial workforce as a country. I do a lot of construction economics. We don't have enough carpenters, glaziers, HVAC professionals, electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters. We don't have enough machinists. We don't have enough welders. We don't have drivers. And so, that backbone of the economy is not well served by sufficient human capital. So that's another issue. If you can't find workers, well, then how am I going to reshore production back to the United States? Lack of meaningful tax incentives, 40%, and then 37%, as I suggested, lack of access to skilled labor, and that's a big issue if you're trying to reshore more production to America. So one of the things that I would love to see for this country is, us training up that industrial labor force, that construction workforce of the future, creating a larger middle class in the process, empowering ourselves to reshore more production back to America, and rebuilding some of that industrial might that we have lost. So even as many companies, I'm now going to the bullets on the right side of the slide, even as many companies look to reshore, there are those significant hurdles. So one of the responses has been third-party warehousing and logistics providers have been part of the solution. 58% of companies responding use third-party warehousing and logistics as an alternative. Next slide, please. Now, this gives us some sense of what's going on. This is US manufacturing job openings. From 2015 to 2019, the number of unfilled US manufacturing jobs averaged about 391,000. In 2020, there was an average of 414,000 unfilled manufacturing jobs. As of July 2021, the number was 889,000 unfilled manufacturing jobs. Now look, this is about 900,000 jobs. Let's round it. 900,000 unfilled manufacturing jobs. Think how much larger our middle class could be if we could find workers to fill these jobs. Now, one of the other things that's happened here is that the labor force participation rate has shrunk over the course of the pandemic. So our labor force participation rate for American adults is down to 61.7%, and it stayed there for months. Now, you might have thought that with all these wage increases we're seeing in the economy, all these job openings, and of course, the fact that those unemployment benefits, those stepped up unemployment federal benefits from the federal government have now lapsed, that a lot of people will be jumping right into the US labor market, taking on some of these jobs, or at least trying to position themselves to take on some of these jobs by entering training programs. Is just not happening. Again, that represents a primary hurdle to formation of a larger American middle class, but also those reshoring episodes. So if you're a manufacturer out there or a distributor and you're having difficulty finding reliable human capital, trainable human capital, you must understand you are certainly not alone. Next slide, please. So, one of the things you do as an employer, and I'm a small business owner myself, is that if you're trying to cobble together a staffing, a staffing force, a staffing to satisfy your staffing model, then you raise wages. This is growth in wages and salaries in the U.S. across all industries, not just manufacturing distribution. This is the employment cost index, and you can see here during the pandemic, we have lost as a country 5.3 million jobs since February of 2020. So we're not recovered yet. In terms of labor market. Our unemployment rate today is 5.2%, pre-pandemic is 3.5%. So ostensibly, it should be pretty easy to find workers right now, but it's not. And one of the things that does, of course, is it pumps up wages and salaries. And so to try to induce more people into labor market to retain more workers, because obviously there's a lot of competition for workers right now, and somebody out there right now is trying to recruit your best worker, and that's just an aspect of economic reality today. Next slide, please. Back to the survey. So what about some of the changes in the distribution channels? Well, that's what this gets at. So from the following list, and this was the question, from the following list, please indicate how COVID-19 has changed your distribution channels. And the impact of COVID-19 has, and now here come the answers, increased e-commerce sales, 56%. Landslide. Increased direct-to-customer delivery, 54%. And that makes sense too. People are taking control of their own supply chain and getting to the customer. And if they can't rely upon the vendors they've been using to get product to their customers, then they take it under their own umbrella. Change demand of product, 52%. The economy has changed. People's taste and preferences have changed with this pandemic. Resulted in a lack of product in the marketplace, 34%. Those are those shortages. Reduced in-person sales, meaning brick and mortar sales, 32%. So e-commerce up, brick and mortar down. And then none of the above, only 3%. So, for almost all of you, this pandemic, this COVID-19 public health crisis has changed business meaningfully. And again, I think a lot of this is sticky. Next slide, please. So, what about the, deeper dive into the e-commerce oriented results? So I'll look toward the left of the slide first. Has online e-commerce grown for your company over the past 12 months? 14% said yes, exponentially, and 54% said yes, significantly. So right there, you're at 2/3 that have seen at least a significant increase in e-commerce growth. And then 23%, another 23% say yes, somewhat. So that's the landslide. That the panel on the right, what is your company's current percentage of online sales? 46% of you said that 51 to 75% of your sales are online. 46% of you said 51 to 75% are online, and that is a plurality. Another 35% of you said 26 to 50%, so more than a quarter of sales are online. Online has won. And do we think that we're going to go back to where we had been along this dimension? I would not think so. One of the permanent effects of this pandemic. Next slide, please. The pandemic, as I pointed out or mentioned very early in the presentation, shifted spending towards goods. So this is more macroeconomic data. This is real personal consumption expenditures by major type of product. So what we're really getting at here more than anything else is consumer. So if you look at the first set of bars here, in the second quarter of 2019, so this is a bit less than a year before the pandemic begins, 64% of money was spent on services. It could be anything, right? It could be, hotels. It could be other forms of services, but 64%. 1 year later, during the second quarter of 2020, which is, of course, the quarter in which the U.S. economy absolutely melted apart, 61% on services. Now goods is up to 39%. 39%. So again, couldn't take a vacation, couldn't stay at a hotel, whatever it happens to be, didn't go to a restaurant. The economy shut down. People are nervous about infection, so they start buying goods, whether it's exercise equipment for their homes or whatever it happens to be. Fast forward another year, second quarter of 2021, which is the last quarter for which we have data, and the move towards goods has continued even though the pandemic has waned in terms of its effect. So now goods represents 41% of spending. Now, if you're a manufacturer distributor, this has to be really heartening because you can't transport services. You can't manufacture services necessarily, right? You manufacture goods, you distribute goods, and the move has been towards goods and away from services. Now, will that continue? I suspect that there will be some slide back towards services once this pandemic really fades from view and people can freely travel on airplanes in a way that makes them feel safe, those kinds of things. But for right now, you can see that pretty massive sea change toward goods. Next slide, please. But this is e-commerce retail sales as a percentage of total sales. So now we're talking about consumer-based purchasing. A lot of what we've talked about so far in this presentation has been about business-to-business e-commerce. This is business-to-customer e-commerce. Prior to the pandemic, about 11.4% of retail sales took place online. During the worst of the pandemic, that rose to 15.7%. I'm looking at this purple line here and have pointed out some of these data points. 15.7%. More recently, it slid back down to 13.3% as parts of the economy have reopened. And I frequent various malls. I'm from Baltimore, so I go to Towson Town Center or some other malls around here. They seem pretty busy. But if you look at the trend line, if you go from that point where we are at 11.4% and sort of do a trend line going forward, e-commerce is bigger in terms of market share than it would have been but for the pandemic. Next slide, please. Back to the survey. Again, one of the things I wanted to do is discuss, permanent changes versus temporary changes attributable to the pandemic. So let's go through some of these results here. So most companies think some COVID-19 related changes are here to stay. Well, I think you're right. I think some of these changes are here to stay. Asked how likely it is that some of the new ways people purchase goods, online purchases, grocery deliveries, et cetera, will become permanent fixtures post-COVID-19, 93% of respondents say that it is somewhat or very likely that such changes are here to stay. I'm going broke basically as a human being because my younger daughter orders Starbucks online almost every day. And that is probably not going to change. More than half of companies see e-commerce success as one of the top two biggest keys to future growth. Let me repeat that. More than half of companies, this is you speaking now, more than half of companies see e-commerce success as one of the top two biggest keys to future growth. It's your online platform. Technology and new products are also seen as keys to future growth strategies. So if you look at the graph toward the right here, we summarize this for you. E-commerce, biggest keys to your future growth strategy, e-commerce 54%. Technology, 49%. New products, 43%. Of course, this answer is not mutually exclusive, but the point is e-commerce is number one. Even above technology, even above new products, it's about e-commerce. It's about that distribution channel and reaching through that distribution channel. But everyone is trying to do this. So how is a manufacturer or distributor does one separate themselves or distinguish themselves from everybody else trying to do something similar? And that therein lies the challenge. Next slide, please. So with the world in flux, right, prices rising, customers changing their behavior, technology, of course, shifting. People talk about manufacturing 4.0, those kinds of things. So my goodness, as a business executive, as someone trying to run one of these companies, you'd say, well, there's just too much going on. I can't keep up. And yet, many of you have said, you're ready. You're dealing with this. So Citron Cooperman's Pulse survey indicates that generally respondents feel good about plans and readiness following COVID-19. You feel good. So let me just cherry pick on the right of the slide here. My company has a solid business plan in place following COVID-19. 52% of you strongly agree. 38% of you somewhat agree. Well, that's 90% between the two. Say, yeah, we're pretty good in terms of our business plan. You're always trying to refine it, of course, and you're always trying to roll with the punches. Everyone understands that. The world is changing quickly. But for the most part, many of you said, no, we're ready. We're ready. My company foresees continued growth following COVID-19. 48% strongly agree, 45% somewhat agree. That's 93%. Foreseeing continued growth despite all these fluctuations, despite all these supply chain disruptions, despite all of this, reshoring activity. It just changes to global supply chains dynamically. You feel pretty ready and you feel like you're going to continue to grow. My company has a solid business plan in place for crisis management. 38% strongly agree, 50% somewhat agree. That's 88% of you. At least some would agree with that statement. You're ready if there is some kind of crisis, whether it's you can't get your some key input or your supply chain somehow becomes interrupted by some geopolitical event. You feel like you're ready. You have a plan in place. Next slide, please. So let me talk just very briefly about what to think about the economy during the months ahead as we plow toward 2022. Now, we economists have a tendency to excessively complicate matters, and we do this on purpose. The notion is that if you can't understand what we're saying, you will deem us to be highly intelligent human beings. But in economics, it boils down to just two things. It did hundreds of years ago, it will hundreds of years from now. Two things, demand and supply. And the principal source of demand in our country, the United States of America, is the consumer. You've heard the statement a million times, well, the consumer is 2/3 of the economy. What they really are 2/3 of aggregate demand. And the consumer is such outsized importance, therefore, that we don't just monitor what they're doing, how much they're buying, what prices they're paying, so on and so forth. We do that, of course. We monitor retail sales and inflation at the consumer level and those kinds of things. But we also monitor their psychology. Are they happy? Really like the president. This is University of Michigan's Index of Consumer Sentiment, and the consumer right now is down in the dumps. They are not happy. They're not happy about the fact that this pandemic lingers, that this Delta variant is here. They might not be happy about some of the foreign policy outcomes that we have seen recently. I mean, there might be quite a few things. They might not be happy about inflation, higher fuel prices, so on and so forth. But I could make the argument, and I think this matters for manufacturers and distributors on their outlook going forward. I could make the argument that financially, consumers have never been healthier in this country. Now, at some level, that sounds pretty insensitive, doesn't it? But I know and you know that many Americans are facing food insecurity, don't have health insurance, are facing evictions, so on and so forth. Yes, that's true. Microeconomically, there are many families in America that are struggling. And that was true before the pandemic. That's even more true after 18 months of pandemic. But I'm speaking macroeconomic. And macroeconomically, I can make the statement or the claim that the American consumer, again, writ large, has never been financially better position. Next slide, please. This is the U.S. savings rate. This is savings as a percentage of personal disposable income. What this really reflects is the amount of money that consumers or households take out of their paychecks every couple of weeks and set aside in some account. Could be checkings, could be savings, could be 401k, but the point is they're not spending that money right away. So coming into the crisis, the US savings rate is around 8%. By April of 2020, it's 33.7%. And why is that? Money is coming to the household, stimulus payments, stepped up unemployment insurance benefits. Many people don't lose their jobs, but the spending opportunities are few and far between. Can't go to a ballpark, can't go to a vacation, can't go to a restaurant. So the savings bubbles up on the household balance sheet. As the economy reopens and fits and starts, those savings turn into expenditures, and the US economy has that V-shaped recovery. But as late as July of 2021, the savings rate is still nearly 10%. American consumers in the aggregate have amassed about $3.1 trillion in excess savings, meaning savings above and beyond what would have transpired but for the pandemic. That $3 trillion of money is ready to be spent. It's savings, it's on household balance sheets. So the demand side of the economy is supercharged. It's ready to take off. Next slide, please. What is the issue then? Well, obviously, we've talked a lot about these supply chain disruptions, these higher input costs, more inflation, so on and so forth. But one of the other things that we've seen is a lack of small business optimism in this country. This comes from the National Federation of Independent Business. This is their index of small business optimism. Question Small Business America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? In July, you can see here only 13% of small business operators said yes to that question. They can't find workers. They're facing higher input costs. Some of them have been hit hard by the Delta variant. For instance, people who operate specialty retail or operate restaurants or hotels. So some of that activity has been dulled by the Delta variant. And so there's not much confidence there. And it's a great rapper, Rob Bass, said in 1988, it takes two to make a thing go right. And he was speaking clearly about the macroeconomy. So the demand side has the potential to be strong, but there's some demand hesitation there because of the Delta variant. And the supply side needs to be strong for the economy to participate, to really have a robust recovery. But the supply side continues to be hammered by supply chain disruptions, inflation, so on and so forth, and a lack of small business confidence. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? For an economy to flourish, both demand and supply sides of the economy must participate with ongoing stimulus. And the Biden administration, of course, is talking about more stimulus. We'll see what Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia has to say about this. Senator Kristen Sinema of Arizona. These are the two most conservative Democrats. It's a 50-50 Senate, so they have a lot of say. I say to you, Joe Manchin is the most powerful man in Washington right now, or most powerful person. So we'll see what comes out of the Biden stimulus packages. But assuming we get some more stimulus, demand will get a further boost. But supply continues to be constrained by numerous factors. We've talked about some of those factors, and not just in America. The globe is still under pressure because of COVID-19. The result is that the U.S. savings rate will remain elevated for the foreseeable future, and that continues to spring-load the economy for rapid economic growth once vaccines become more broadly available and Delta goes away, though, of course, lately people have also been talking about this Mu variant. The back half of 2021 should have been spectacular for economic growth. It should have been, the period we're living in right. Right now, it's okay. You saw in the last jobs report, we only added 235,000 jobs in August. The consensus estimate was 750,000 jobs would be added in August. We added 500,000 fewer jobs than that, as it turns out. That's the Delta variant, supply chain disruptions, lack of confidence among consumers and businesses alike. I still believe that the fourth quarter of this year will be spectacular for economic growth. As I look at the data, the Delta variant seems to have peaked a few days ago, early September. And if we can continue to see a decline in the Delta variant-oriented cases, then we might really be able to see a reopening of this U.S. economy even more forcefully into that fourth quarter. And of course, that's the holiday shopping season. 2022 will be another year requiring aggressive management, constant change, and exploration of partnership opportunities. I wish you happy holidays as we march toward the Christmas season. With that, I am done with my prepared or ill-prepared materials. Thanks again to Citra Cooperman for that fabulous survey and garnering all of those responses. Let's go to Q&A.
Arban, once again, great job. Great job. Really appreciate it going through everything. Again, as Mark Henry had mentioned in the opening, my name is John Giordano. I'm partnering here with Citra Cooperman. By popular demand, I'll be replacing Mark on the back end of this presentation. So Arban delivered again. Thank you again. Great job tying in the survey results, from over 200 manufacturers and distributors, tying into the economic data that you're seeing, how everything marries up. Really appreciate it. I think it really kind of brought the two sides together, what they're seeing in their everyday businesses, all the way down to what the economists are seeing as well. So again, it really paints a full picture for us. Let me just jump right into the Q&As right here. We have a couple trickling in. it looks like a lot of it's going to be geared around two major topics of labor and supply chain. So let's kick off with this one. As labor continues to be a major issue in our industry and across all the industries, with the discontinued extended unemployment, will the jobs start to come back, do you think, at any point? Where do you see it trending, and where has everybody been? Where has everybody gone?
Well, let me try to answer that, John. And John, yes, you are a welcome replacement for Mark, I must say. You're just fantastic. But no, I don't think so. Here's the thing. I think there was, over the course of the summer, a lot of discussion about what the effects of these stepped up federal benefits were for those who are unemployed and how that was affecting the intensity of their job search. And the notion had been in much of the country, or among many people, that as soon as we get through this period and these federal benefits lapse, people will jump into labor market. Well, as it turns out, about 24 governors, many of them from the American South, in June, decide to terminate those federal benefits, unemployment insurance. So we've had for now 3 months data coming in from states that had caused those benefits to preemptively lapse, and we have not seen any significant change in the employment or hiring trends in those states relative to states that kept those benefits in place until the end date of September 6th. So what that tells us is that there are other issues preventing people from re-entering the workforce. It could be affordable childcare. It could be cultural shift during the pandemic. And one of the things I think that's happened is that worker expectations are much loftier than they were pre-pandemic. So what happened here? Many people lost their jobs early in the pandemic. That's true. We lost 1.7 million jobs in March of 2020, and then 20.7 million jobs in April of 2020. So 22.4 million jobs in 2 months. And a lot of people saw their living standards increase. So, at that time, you might remember they were receiving $600 a week from the federal government on top of their state unemployment insurance benefits. So 68% of those workers were making more on unemployment than they were at their previous job. So now they have become accustomed to a certain lifestyle. They're staying at home, they're relaxing, they're making a fair amount of money. They're not making it, actually, they're being given that money. But the point is, they're enjoying a lifestyle. And now they're being asked to come back to work. Those benefits have lapsed. And they're saying, well, that's what I want. I want the lifestyle I had at the early stages of the pandemic. Pay me that. And the employer's looking around and saying, I can't afford to pay that. And then, and so what happens is you've got the stalemate, and a lot of people are staying out of the workforce. There are other things too, yeah, go ahead.
As a follow-up, do you think it's just deferred? Do you think they're burning through that excess of 10% savings that you talked about, and eventually they'll be reintroduced? And if not, one of the questions that actually just came through, where are manufacturers finding this labor? And attack onto that, I'm sorry to make it a three-part question, but are you seeing more companies that invest in like AI and other alternatives to meet these capacity constraints? Yeah,
so I was going to say, one of the other factors here is that there are a lot of people out there who are afraid of both vaccination and infection. So that's another factor keeping them out. So yes, I would think that at some point, as people burn through those stimulus payments they've received, so they're spending down their savings, that as the bills are coming due and they're no longer income to offset those bills, that you will see into 2022 more people jumping back into the labor market. But I've also noticed that more households are saying that, before we were a 2-income household, we're happy with 1 income. I noticed there's a lot of people who want that flex time. So, they're going into the gig economy, they're back to Uber and Lyft driving, so on and so forth. So that brings us to that second question, where are manufacturers finding workers? Wherever they can find them. So, I'm from the Mid-Atlantic region, so we've got schools like Delaware Tech, that trains that kind of workforce. We need more of those schools, more apprenticeship programs in this country. But right now, what's happened is that workers are able to find such decent jobs from their perspective without any training that they're taking that. When Amazon offers new workers $15 to $17 an hour untrained, why would I enter an apprenticeship program for 2 to 4 years, train myself up for maybe $5 or $10 an hour more than that? Maybe I won't do that. So it is really challenging right now. And so, and one of the other things that we suffered during this period was the loss of a lot of baby boomers from the workforce. Many baby boomers retired early because their 401ks became fat, or because they lost a job early during the pandemic and simply threw in the towel. And those have been some of our most productive workers. So with respect to the third part of the question, AI, robotics, so on and so forth, absolutely. that what we're seeing right now is a crescendo of investment among manufacturers and others to replace that human capital that they cannot find. You're going to see more of this. You're going to see in construction, for instance, more bricklaying being done by robots. Throughout the supply chain, you're going to see more automation. So that's part of the revolution here. And my hope is that we Americans are the ones who manufacture that equipment, at least on automation, creating another generation of jobs. But of course, you've got to train an industrial workforce for that to happen.
Great, thank you for that. One thing that you touched on, just want to check here as they come through. Here's the one. So as you see, you touched on it briefly at the end, the new administration and what's going on in Washington. So do you see any major advances for manufacturing distributors in the pending infrastructure bill? Is there anything there that highlights that could be of some relief to these companies?
Well, I mean, the administration has said from day one, actually before day one, we stand for good union jobs. That has been the mantra. More than any other thing about this administration, we stand for good union jobs. Now, some people look at that positively, some not so much. But the point is, manufacturing is really what the president has in mind. He has Scranton, Pennsylvania in mind when he says these kinds of things. And so one presumes that if we get an infrastructure package passed, ultimately that final version of that package will really benefit manufacturers, whether it's folks who manufacture infrastructure for electric vehicles or other forms of ongoing technological change and shift. Manufacturing will be one of the beneficiaries of that infrastructure package. Now, right now, that infrastructure package is sort of in flux because there's another package out there, a $3.5 trillion stimulus package that some Democrats also want to pass. And so some Democrats are saying, well, you're not going to get your infrastructure package if we don't get this $3.5 trillion package. And so it's basically an internecine conflict within the Democratic Party to see what we're going to get. But yes, absolutely, an infrastructure package would be of great value to manufacturers. And I'm not so sure the $3.5 trillion package would be of great value because that would create more of a social safety net and perhaps keep more people out of the labor force. And of course, right now we need more labor force participation.
Great, thank you. Let me see here. Here's one on supply chain. We talked a lot about labor. So given the current supply chain issues that you mentioned throughout, and you mentioned that they were transitory, what strategies do you see companies taking to try and mitigate some of these effects, if any?
Oh, I think they move around supply chain. I think, in the 1980s, when Jack Welch was CEO of General Electric, there was this mantra that was born, which was that if you want to be a profit maximizer, you have to be a cost minimizer. And if you want to be a cost minimizer as a manufacturer, you better manufacture in China. And so we saw all this offshoring to China. And of course, the Chinese have been very good manufacturers. They've cobbled together their industrial workforce, they have all kinds of capacity. They've invested a lot in that infrastructure to support distribution, so on and so forth, within that country, and then invested in seaports to get product out of that country. So they've done a very good job of that. And that's why they're home to a quarter of global manufacturing today. But now what we see is a world changed. China's become more expensive. Intellectual property has become more valuable and needs more protection. The Chinese government has become more involved into the day-to-day affairs of the Chinese economy and the manufacturing economy. And so given all these supply chain disruptions, given that China has become a more complex place from which to operate, many people have shifted production. So one of the things we saw was a lot of production shifted to Vietnam. Some shifted to Malaysia. That has created its own set of problems, especially during COVID-19. So whether it's auto parts components coming out of Malaysia or components for shoes coming out of Vietnam, this create other bottlenecks. So if Asia is going to be associated with such bottlenecks, you'd want to bring more production back to the United States of America. And I think that's what's happening. And when you look at other surveys of CEOs, many CEOs who have maintained a lot of supply chain in China are now saying, I want to bring a lot of that supply chain back to the United States of America. Now, it doesn't happen instantaneously, but the thought is there. And so that's one of the ways I think you're going to see American manufacturers respond. They're going to bring more of that supply chain here. The problem is we don't have a workforce to really support that right now.
Great. Thank you for that. Here's another one that just came in. For business to business and business to government, do you see e-commerce applies the same as B2C?
Well, I know I mentioned earlier that in terms of e-commerce intensity, e-commerce is actually more intensely observable in the business-to-business space. Now, in terms of business to government, it's just not clear because governments are so different from businesses, and they have so many standard operating procedures. They're dealing with taxpayer money. They're, having to worry about all kinds of things like trade secrets and so on and so forth, and they need to protect people's information, all these kinds of stuff. So it's more complicated. So my guess is that in terms of procurement, you'll see less of a rapid shift toward e-commerce than we've seen on the business-to-business side. But even there, you'll see, yes, a move to e-commerce because businesses trying to streamline. We have a national government that has almost a $29 trillion national debt. So they need to become more efficient as well in terms of sourcing goods and services. So yeah, long answer to your short question, but business to business is where we've seen the most migration to e-commerce, followed by business to the consumer. And I think maybe in third place is business to government, but that's likely to change as well.
Very good. Thank you. Just checking the clock. I think we have time for one more here. So this one kind of goes into the current M&A market. So let's go through this one. If the supply chain issues continue at their current pace with no end in sight, or potentially an end in sight, what will the effects have on the valuation of M&D businesses? Right now, there's a lot of M&A activity, but will that cool off?
Oh, I think that for manufacturers with some scale, who have the purchasing power, who therefore are able to obtain inputs that other small companies cannot obtain because they just have more financial wherewithal to pay more and get those inputs in, and therefore keep that productive machinery in place, that this benefits larger players and small players. And if that's correct, if that answer is correct, that larger players benefit from this kind of market situation or circumstances, supply chain disruptions, relative to smaller players with less market power and capacity to reach out and find new suppliers, then yes, you would actually see more consolidation going forward in manufacturing as scale economies become more important. So that's what I would expect to come out of this, more merger and acquisition activity. We've seen a lot of M&A activity in both manufacturing and distribution. I think you'll continue to see that going forward, and COVID-19 is part of that story.
Great. I'll do a last call on questions here as I go through here to make sure that we've touched on everything. I think on our end, everything that's come through has been answered. So if we don't have any further questions, we could bring the webinar to a close. Again, I'd like to thank Arvon for spending time with us today, giving us his economic insights and how it relates to our M&D Pulse survey. Wait, one more question did come in for Arvon. Are the Ravens going to cover next weekend? Who's that from? Is that from you?
No, that's not from me. The Ravens will cover tonight against the Raiders in Las Vegas. That's right. The Ravens, however, have been hit with a rash of injuries, as it turns out. So anyway, I don't believe what I'm saying. I'm going to always say the Ravens are going to cover. So whatever the question. So, but yes, the Ravens will cover tonight.
All right. Thanks again. Again, your economic insights have been very helpful in bringing the findings from our M&D survey out to manufacturing distributors alike. We appreciate everyone for attending. Hope you found it informative, and please look for a taped version of this webinar to be up on our Citron Cooperman website. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week. Thank you, everyone.